I apologize for not being able to be there in person. That is certainly my absolute preference, is to see everybody that I'm talking with rather than see my own computer screen. So I wish I could be there with you in person. And I do appreciate the invitation to come speak with you today. And so I'm going to look into my crystal ball and tell you kind of what we're thinking for 2021 and what the weather might bring us. So there's my contact information here to get started, and I'll share it again at the end of the presentation. So first off, since this conference is being sponsored by several organizations that sponsor Nebraska Mesonet weather stations, I wanted to be sure and thank those sponsors. For those of you that are not familiar with our weather network, we have about 64 stations statewide. Our goal is to have one in every county. So the counties that do not have a Mesonet station, we're working toward implementing those all across Nebraska. But this is our current network. This is one of our products that we have available. This I grabbed a few days ago. This happens to be a cattle comfort index. You can get real-time weather information from this, as well as derived products such as what you see here. So I just wanted to give a shout out to the Tri-Basin NRD, and John, thank you very much. The Lower Republican NRD, CNPPID, and Nebraska Extension, and those weather stations that are those values that have a little red box around them. Those are people that financially sponsor stations in this area. So I just wanted to be sure and thank you all for keeping good observations going and keeping that funded. All right, so for today's presentation, when looking forward with weather conditions and impacts, we always want to look at what has happened so we can see kind of where we are now. So I'll do a bit of a recap and recent conditions, do a drought assessment and how that has changed over time. And then finally, what you're all most interested in, I'm sure, is the outlook. And in essence, what I'll be showing is that in the near term, for February, we're looking at kind of a change in the pattern of cold and wet conditions in the near term. I am cautiously optimistic for a wet spring and hopefully a decent soil moisture recharge. We all know that there's droughts covering much of the state, and so I'm optimistic that some of these conditions will be somewhat alleviated with a spring moisture recharge. So those are the topics that I'll cover. So I'll get right into a 2020 recap. So in terms of temperature and precipitation, this is showing you the national picture. But if we just zero in on for Nebraska, so on the left, we can see that we had above average temperatures overall for the year 2020 in Nebraska statewide. The bigger story probably is precipitation. So here we ranked 16th driest on record, and that goes back to 1895. So the interesting thing is obviously this is coming off of a very wet year, where in 2019 we had the third wettest year on record. So kind of these back-to-back extremes, wet versus dry, tend to be happening more frequently in Nebraska. If you look at the time series plot and how our precipitation as well as temperatures fare, we seem to be getting more variable, especially in the last few decades. That's how 2020 ended. And by the way, I'm happy to share these PowerPoint slides. You'll note that at the bottom of these slides, I've put the URL. If you're interested in these specific graphics that I'm showing, then it'll tell you where you can get those. But again, I'm happy to share this PowerPoint slides with whoever would like them. Okay, so for the fall, September, October, November, we were 9th driest on record. It was mostly warm and a very dry fall. And that certainly has some implications in regard to lack of a fall moisture recharge for those soils. This dry fall, as well as warm, is somewhat of a signature of a La Nina pattern, which is what we're currently in, and I'll talk more about that later. So this warm and dry fall did verify for Nebraska in this La Nina pattern that we're currently in. All right, so temperatures. December and January temperatures, we've been fairly warm overall. You know, it's cool right now, and we have had some cold air outbreaks and obviously some snow events that have impacted us. But overall, December and January, the last 60 days, have been warmer than average, anywhere from 2 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than normal. January, the rankings haven't come out yet, but I looked this morning and we averaged about 4 degrees warmer than normal for January. But I think that's going to change, and February will look different than what we have seen. But this is how winter has fared overall in terms of temperature. And the next image that you see here is looking over that same time period. So December and January, this is a precipitation departure from normal. So it's not the total, it's a departure from normal. And the colors that are in green and blue, those are going to be wetter than normal. And then anything in those warmer colors, the yellow that you see on the map, that is drier than normal. And it's important to note, as most of you know, I'm sure, that December, January, those are our driest months of the year. If we look at the water equivalent precipitation, this is our driest time of year. So our departures are, luckily for the central and east, we've been a bit wetter than normal. That's what we need, especially going into this spring. We're wanting these wetter than normal conditions. But this is how we have fared in the past 2 months. Okay, the next few slides, I'm going to focus in a bit on precipitation. So let's look over the past year. And the next slide, I'm going to look at drought conditions and how that has developed. So again, 2019, we're coming off of a very wet year. 2020, we saw that was 16th driest on record. There is variance across Nebraska. And if there's anybody in attendance or listening in from the central part of the state, that it's not quite as bad there. Your conditions might not be too bad compared to the southwest, western parts of the state and the panhandle or in the northeast. This is precipitation over the past 12-month time period. So going back a year from now, precipitation it has been about 70% of normal. So this is, in terms of percent of normal, this is how we have fared over the last 12 months. And certainly that's reflected in the US Drought Monitor maps. And I am interested actually offline, if any of you have specific feedback with regard to the US Drought Monitor, I would be very happy to hear your localized feedback. The Drought Monitor is something I tell folks, and I'm not in charge of this map. I give information that the Drought Monitor authors use to produce this map. But what I like to do is collect feedback from users of the data and people that are out in the field to see what are they experiencing and how does this relate to their conditions. Is D2 or D3 descriptive of what you see in your area? So it's always good to do kind of that local sanity check in this. So I just wanted to mention, for those of you interested in providing feedback to the Drought Monitor, please feel free to do so, and you can send that to me. So the Drought Monitor, the classification change over the past year. These are all orange colors that you're seeing here. A year ago, we had very little, no drought. We had some abnormal dryness was all, I believe. So no drought conditions. And so what a difference a year makes, right, in Nebraska. And so the current Drought Monitor, this came out last Thursday, so the new one will be released in a couple of days. That's effective of today's conditions. 24% of Nebraska is in that D3 or extreme drought category. That's in the red color that you see here. So South Central, Southwest Nebraska, and portions of the Panhandle are in that D3 category of drought. There's been some alleviation out in the eastern part of the state. In the wintertime, typically we don't see a lot of significant adjustments to the US Drought Monitor map. Some of the impacts are not as strong perhaps, or they don't change quite as quickly as compared to the growing season. But thinking about how this map looks today, I wouldn't expect major changes to this at the start of the growing season. Okay, so we'll zoom out and look at what conditions are in the high plains. I always like to look at what is around us, because drought is it's a very complex thing in the climate of Nebraska, and it's this creeping phenomena. And so will we start to see drought kind of, or more exceptional drought creeping into this area, or potential alleviation? And it has been dry across the High Plains region. If we look into Wyoming and Colorado specifically, they've had exceptional drought conditions. In 2019, more than a year ago, they experienced a period of time where they had no drought in Colorado, which was unusual, but that has crept back in. We've had kind of a ridge develop over the western U.S., and so it has been quite dry there. So that's the regional perspective of drought. And so here I'm going to just look at drought in another way, and that is over time. And here I'm zeroing in on South Central Nebraska specifically. So it's not the state as a whole, but it's just South Central part of Nebraska. This is one of the climate divisions in this Climate Division 8 in the state. So you're seeing a history, since the U.S. Drought Monitor has been in place, what are the drought conditions for South Central Nebraska? And one thing that I think is interesting is, we all, of course, remember the 2012, 2013 drought that was short-lived. Luckily, it didn't last over a period of years, but we've been in a pretty wet pattern here so far. And so the drought that we're experiencing, we haven't quite had anything like this, in fact, since the end of that 2012 drought. So in terms of a time series, this is what our drought history has looked like. All right, so I've talked about precipitation deficits. I've talked about drought conditions according to the U.S. Drought Monitor. Let's talk a little bit about soil moisture conditions. And here you're looking at an image that I grabbed. It's a modeled perspective, so it's not great at pinpointing at specific locations on the map, but it's giving you a general picture of soil moisture conditions across the country. And if we look in Nebraska, here I've got the square around it. Parts of the state are in the 10th percentile or less for soil moisture amount. And this is in about the top meter or so depth. So we're looking at kind of the top layer in the root zone. And you can see how it is worse in the western, where it's in the top one. So only 99% of those years, or in Nebraska, it'd be 90% of the years, are going to have more soil moisture than what we have right now, which may not be something of surprise to those of you who are out there working in your fields regularly. So again, this is a modeled perspective and reflective of kind of the larger scale pattern. So I'll do one more kind of statewide perspective. If any of you happen to look at the weekly crop and weather reports that USDA distributes, the URL again is given there in the lower right-hand corner. They don't produce these moisture maps during the winter time. This is one of the last ones that they did produce, but I like to look at this to know during the recharge season, how are our moisture conditions? And again, this is a statewide number, so it's not going to be, it might not be exactly accurate to your local area, but just in general, how is Nebraska faring? The image that you see is subsoil moisture. And Nebraska was at 71% in the short to very short category for that subsoil moisture. Topsoil was at about 65% in the short to very short category. And again, you can see how the Western US has been quite dry. Different situation in the eastern part of the country where they've been exceptionally wet over the last year. So this kind of dichotomy of what's going on throughout the US, and often Nebraska, we're right in the middle of the country, in the middle of the continent. This is kind of where all the action happens. And so the position of the jet stream and the exact track of storms that move through, that can kind of make or break us here in Nebraska. All right, so we'll zoom in a little bit more locally. So at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned those that sponsor Nebraska Mesonet weather stations. And a metric that we do have on our stations is soil moisture. We have it under grass cover, and these are not agricultural fields, but this is grass cover that is in these areas. These are not urban locations. You know, these are outside of the city. Native vegetation, for the most part, is what these soil moisture conditions are under. So here we're looking at 4-inch depth on the left and then 20-inch depth on the right. On our website, mesonet.unl.edu, you can find down to the 40-inch depth as well. And what this is showing you is the percent of total volume that that water is taking up. And so it's dependent on the type of soil that we have in a given area. But one thing you can see is that for the western part of the state, we've got these different percentages than we do in the east. And even taking out the difference in soil type in these particular areas, we can see from the station and site-specific data that it is dry in these locations. So if you have an area of interest, say in the south central part of the state, you're welcome to look at these maps. They're updated daily, so they will fluctuate depending on precipitation events that we get and how the water percolates through the soil profile. But here just gives you, again, a general look at what the soil moisture conditions are across the state. So we also observe soil temperature at these stations. That's done over grass cover as well as bare soil. And so I just wanted to make mention of what the soil temperatures are. Where are they right now? This is a weekly average plot. I developed this presentation a few days ago, and so the data is a few days old, but this gives you a weekly average. And so this, every hour of the day we record an observation. And so it's an average of your daily high and low temperatures. So the soils are, if you look at the daily plots, they are going to get warmer during the day and colder at night. But in terms of a weekly average, this is what our soil temperatures are looking like. So we're kind of right around the freezing point here. All right. And snow, I guess I should have mentioned on the other slide, it's important when thinking about snow cover and what's going to infiltrate, what's going to get into the ground. You know, are the soils frozen or not? So that's it's always an interesting graphic that I look at during the wintertime to see how much of the snow cover that we have can kind of percolate through the ground. Okay, we'll look at another part of you know, things that we pay attention to in Nebraska, and that is looking at snowpack conditions. And just the other night, I found these interesting looks at the basin. And so I'm going to show the South Platte Basin and the North Platte Laramie Basin. So for those that are, you know, the folks at CNPPID, those that are looking at stream flows and looking at how much water equivalent is in that snowpack, what's the timing of snowmelt and so forth. These are very interesting to track throughout the year. So for the South Platte, what you're seeing here, the red curves is a median and an average, which don't show a lot of difference. And it's showing you the current year and the past 3 years. So for the South Platte, and we are relatively early in the snow accumulation season for the Rocky Mountains, that usually peaks in late April or so. So we're running slightly above average in terms of snow water equivalents for the South Platte River Basin. And my next slide here is for Laramie and North Platte River Basin. So again, the average is in red, and then those color lines are the past few years. The black is 2021. So for the North Platte Basin, and actually this is true for a lot of the northern Rockies, we're running below average for our water equivalent in terms of snowpack. And this is somewhat of a signature, perhaps La Nina could be driving this. Again, we've seen a ridge over the Western US. We're seeing some evidence of that probably breaking down. And so more switching to more of an active weather pattern as we get later in the winter here. But again, this is how the snowpacks are faring thus far. Again, these are important to track and watch throughout the snow accumulation season, as we do have a ways to go, a lot of time yet to build up that snowpack, but this is how we're running currently. Okay, so I'll switch to kind of the climate outlook portion of the presentation here. And one of the factors that climate that goes into these climate outlooks, meaning, past about day 10, it's considered a climate outlook. So here we're talking about the next month or season and so forth. And that's actually probably the most difficult time period to predict and to forecast for. There's a lot of variability and there's a lot of factors that go into determining what the conditions will be like past that scale of about 1 week or so. But anyway, what is driving some of these outlooks that I'm going to be showing, these climate scale outlooks, is the La Nina pattern. We're currently in a La Nina, which essentially means cool waters in the equatorial Pacific. That implies that we have a certain jet stream pattern. So what happens in that huge basin of the equatorial Pacific, it has implications globally. Unfortunately, the signal is actually not very strong for Nebraska. It is for other parts of the country, but not for Nebraska, which is too bad. But the image that you see here shows you overall, what do we typically expect during winter in a La Nina pattern? Cold to the north and wet to the north and warm and dry to the south. In general, that's how La Ninas play out during the wintertime. You can see kind of a ridge over the west, and you can see where this purple here over kind of the Four Corners region, that's certainly playing out where it is dry kind of over that, the southern Intermountain West there. But what we're likely to see, what's in the outlook, is a shift away from this La Nina pattern to neutral conditions by late spring. So that's what the climate forecasters are predicting. Okay, so I will start kind of on the weather scale of what the outlook is. So if you're concerned about kind of the next week or so, precipitation over the next 7 days, you can see much of the country is predicted to get some precipitation. It's fairly light across Nebraska. It's wet to the east. You can see the storm that is off in the Atlantic Ocean now. That was the nor'easter that was impacting the northeast part of the country. You can see that shifting off to the east. Continued wet in the east. For us here in the plains, not a whole lot of precipitation across the state. Again, this is only on the 1 to 7 day time scale. So from today through about the 9th of February. But we are seeing evidence of changes. So getting into a wetter pattern and colder as well. That's probably the bigger signal in the short term, is colder than normal. So for early February, this image picks up where that last image left off. We're looking at February 9th through the 15th. So that second week in February, much of the lower 48 is in blue there, which you see. The darker the blue, the higher the probability of below normal temperatures. So that's what we're likely to see. It's certainly in the forecast. If you are a cattle producer, if you're a rancher, if you have livestock, prepare for below zero temperatures, low wind chills, low cattle comfort indices. That one of the first graphics that I showed to start this presentation, we do have a real-time cattle comfort index. And so if you're interested in that metric, you can look at that in real time and see what the conditions are. So again, cooler than normal is what we're looking at, as well as wetter than normal. So kind of an active, cold and active pattern, which is a shift from what we have been seeing. Okay, we keep going out further in time. This is for the month of February, and this was updated the last day of January. And as a climate person, when I look at these outlooks that are produced by NOAA, I tend to, these get revised. And so I tend to look at them, the most recent one that's available, because the one for February did look different in NOAA's previous version of this. And so here they're picking up on that cold and wet pattern. You see blue on the left and you see green on the right. So I think February could signal kind of a change in based on from what we have, because we have been warm so far this winter. I think these changes look like they should be realized. Climatologically, this is our snowiest month, February. And what's interesting is if you look at the last 3 decades or so, Februaries have gotten significantly colder. Not every February is colder than the previous one, but overall, the last 3 decades, we are trending toward colder Februaries. So this is the timing that we tend to have more frequent cold air and Arctic outbreaks. So you might have heard talk kind of in the news or in the media about the polar vortex and breaking down and influx of Arctic air. This is kind of a reflection of that. More wavy jet stream pattern, that air that was locked up in the Arctic that is being able to be to infiltrate the mid latitudes. So I believe that's what we're seeing here. So that's kind of in the shorter term. That's for February. So let's look out further. There are seasonal outlooks that are produced. This one is March, April, May. So for the spring months, this is climatological spring. This looks different than what the map showed for February. It's showing overall warmer than normal. And this drier than normal signal, for now, that is creeping into Nebraska with the wetter than normal kind of staying in the eastern, middle to eastern part of the country. This, particularly the precipitation, this, I think it'd be very interesting will be interesting to track. And when the La Nina does it's officially over and it does break down, when that La Nina pattern breaks down, I could see perhaps that dry signal might tend to shift and we might get a wetter than normal signal. Or that's my hope. I envision that the ridge over the west is likely to start breaking down during the springtime. Okay, so further into 2021, again, these are the types of outlooks that are probably the most difficult to determine because there is so much variability. And again, there's so many factors that go into this. Going out further into 2021, that warmer than normal signal that you saw in the previous graphic for spring, that remains, that stays in place for much of 2021. The precipitation signal, which is what I'm showing here, it does keep Nebraska in this equal chances category, which unfortunately doesn't give a lot of guidance. It means there's equal chances for above, near, and below normal precipitation. What you do see on this image or this pattern is a wet east and kind of a dry in the northwest. Hopefully, those wetter than normal chances shift into Nebraska. As you can, from the drought maps that I showed and from those precipitation deficits, that's what we are needing to go into next growing season. But so far, this is what the 2021 outlook looks like. Okay, just a few more comments here on precipitation deficits before I end in my presentation here and have time for questions. So the deficits over the past 9 months, if we look at, sorry, I'm trying to move around things on my screen. If we look at the departure from normal precipitation going back to about May, say around the start of the growing season, the deficits are in the 5 to 8 inch range. Now it's variable across the state. The central part is faring better, the north central area and the far southeast. We did have some significant precipitation events that were very localized last year. And so those deficits are not quite as strong, but these are the deficits that we are working with. And if we look at kind of a climate, if we go with an average, what is our normal precipitation climatology? And just adding the next 4 months, February through May precipitation provides about 8.5 inches. And so that's a normal. So you can see how that compares to our precipitation deficits. So what we want to see is this wetter than normal and above average precipitation in order to kind of chip away at those precipitation deficits. Okay, so another product that NOAA distributes is a seasonal drought outlook. So based on La Nina conditions, based on warmer than normal temperatures and a number of different factors such as persistence, sometimes they'll go with what has happened in the past. Is that likely to persist or not? So here you can see anything in brown is a persistence of drought conditions. Anything in yellow is drought development. And then anything in green is drought removal, likely. So in terms of this seasonal drought outlook, we're probably not going to see certainly removal of drought conditions. But again, hopefully we'll start to see some improvement. And if we can get this, stay in this active weather pattern, then hopefully we can eat away at some of those precipitation deficits. All right. So this is kind of the takeaway here. If I bored you here over the past several slides, you can wake up and look at these 4 bullet points. And so this summarizes what I talked about. Widespread cool and wet signal for February. So kind of a change from what we have seen in the past. And again, Nebraska during February has cooled pretty significantly over the last 30 years. During this month in particular, we seem to be susceptible to these Arctic air outbreaks during this particular month of the winter. The winter signal overall is less clear for Nebraska, and the seasonal conditions that were experienced, again, that's dependent on the storm track. And so hopefully we'll start to see that ridge pattern in the west breaking down, hopefully, which should wane, and allowing for better moisture chances during the springtime. So hopefully that's going to materialize. And then finally, drought conditions likely won't see major improvements in Nebraska. So expect to start the 21 growing season with low soil moisture reserves, or not maybe a whole lot different than what we have now. Again, in the wintertime, we don't get a lot of water equivalent precipitation. We were fortunate in the east last week to we got about 15 inches of snow in the Lincoln area. The water equivalent was about 1.6 inches, I think, which is very good. That's a lot of moisture for the winter, but that's anomalous. So hopefully the spring moisture will start to pick up. And I'll just mention a couple of things here. We do have a weekly weather update. So the information that I shared with you over this past 30, 40 minutes or so, that is done on a weekly basis. And so if you're interested in tracking conditions and looking at agricultural implications and an update, a weather outlook, we have that available. They're less frequent during the wintertime, but they're done every week during the summertime and during the growing season. And so an important thing to note about weather conditions is things can change pretty quickly. So it's important to keep updating this. And so the information that I shared with you is likely going to shift and change as we go throughout the growing season. So I'd encourage you to visit the URL at the bottom left and visit our weekly weather update. This screenshot is from the most recent one. That's from January. And so we'll have another one here in the next week or two. And then finally, in regard to mesonet stations, this is our most recent one. This is outside of South Central Nebraska, but this one is courtesy of the Nemaha Natural Resource District. They've sponsored one in Johnson County. This is our first one in the county. This is 4 miles southwest of Cook. And in the southwestern part of the state, we'll likely have a new station going in Kimball County, which will be great because we don't have a lot of observations there in that county. So very helpful for drought monitoring activities as well. So I will end there. Maybe I'll go to my next slide, and my contact information is there. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Are there questions for Martha? Go ahead, Dale.
Alan Taylor, when he was state climatologist for Iowa, said there was an 89-year drought cycle. It's supposed to be going into the one that replicates the 30s. Have you done any studies on this?
89 years, you said?
Yeah.
Questioner in the audience says that he had heard from a former Iowa state climatologist, Elvin Taylor, that there is an 89-year drought cycle, and that therefore we could be going into another cycle that might be similar to the 30s.
Good question. So I know Elwyn, yes, I have not heard of an 89-year drought cycle. It seems to happen on shorter frequencies. And if you think about the drought history that I showed, that only goes back to 2000, and we can use other metrics to go back further in time. We do tend to have wet and dry cycles, but as I understand it, they happen more frequently than those 89 years. So that's an interesting one that I had not heard of yet.
I don't know if you can hear that, Marcia. He says it's broken up into 4 different phases, apparently, the cycle repeats.
Okay. Yeah, and it could be driven by some of these climate patterns like El Nino, La Nina, or Pacific Decadal Oscillation, or there's a number of different patterns that that cause the jet stream to be in a certain manner, and then that determines what our weather conditions are. So we can, probably a combination of those kinds of larger scale atmospheric patterns, I would imagine. I do know that over time, if we look at long-term changes, Nebraska has gotten about 10% wetter over time. That is punctuated by drought events, but overall, Nebraska is getting wetter. And that's especially the case in the central part of the state and the Sandhills in particular. That's getting quite wet over time, actually.
Other questions from Martha? We have questions or comments online? Martha, while we're waiting to see about online questions, we had a presenter earlier this morning, Tyler Tulane with the Central Nebraska Public Power and Irrigation District. He showed snowpack trends in the Rocky Mountains, which are far below average. You want to stick your neck out? Do you have any forecasts for how snowpack might end up? Of course, a lot of it still comes in March and April.
Yeah. So I hope to see a shift. I'm going to depart from what the NOAA seasonal climate outlooks say, and they're keeping it dry kind of in the Intermountain West. And I'm thinking that we'll see this breakdown in this La Nina pattern and see this ridge breakdown down. So I'm hopeful and optimistic that we're going to see a wetter spring for the Rockies.
Hopeful for us. I don't know if it's possible for you to go back to your slide presentation, the slide that showed your second to last slide that showed the weather station. If you could maybe describe some of the instruments on there.
Yes, I sure can. This is our tripod configuration. We also have tall towers, but so on our tripod, and can you see the mouse moving?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so this is wind speed and direction. That is at 9 feet. This is our incoming solar radiation. That's facing south here. This is air temperature and relative humidity. That's in a shield to shield it from direct sunlight. That is located here. These stations are off the grid, so there's no plug into them. There's no power. They're self-powered. These are solar panels, so that's how we operate all the equipment. Under this box here, this is our bare soil temperature at 4-inch depth. What you can't see over here, you can see the mouse, that's over grass. And this is, in fact, a very nice site here. It's mowed, and so the grasses are very short at this time. We have 5 depths of soil temperature and soil moisture. What you can't see is in this instrument box right here, that's where data logger is, and cell phone modem and so forth. We have a barometric pressure located in here. So I think I hit on all of one thing you can't see in this picture is liquid precipitation. That is off to the south of the station. So we observe liquid precipitation in those. So that's the setup of our stations. We have several or a handful of towers across Nebraska. The closest tower to your part of the state would probably be at Keystone at Cedar Point Biological Station. And we have temperature and wind at 30 feet high, in addition to everything that you see here.
Okay, very interesting. And any other comments, questions? Okay. Martha, thank you very much for your presentation and for the great information you provided us about upcoming climate developments. We will take note of that Climate Office newsletter and try to check that out.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.